Hi, my name is Kimaya, and I am a biochemistry major. I'm going to be a junior in the fall.
My name's Sam Adams, and I'll be a senior in agronomy this fall.
Hi, I'm Yufan. I'm in the plant and plant pathologist majors, and I will be a senior in the fall. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Michelle. I'm going to be a junior in the fall in animal sciences.
Hi, I'm Sofia. I'm a biological engineering student, and I'm going to be in the fall.
I'm Rachel. I'm a biological engineering student as well, and I'm going to be a senior in the fall.
Okay, so our group, we decided for our broad topic that we wanted to discuss racism in the US. And after looking at it some more, we decided that we wanted to focus more closely on implicit bias because we thought that when you look at racism, underlying all of the racism we see is implicit biases. So that's what we decided to focus on.
So the main three questions that we wanted to address with our project was, what is the basis for implicit bias? How is implicit bias seen in society today? And how can implicit bias be addressed? So for me, I did my 3 immersion activities. My first one was watching the documentary 13th, which is about how slavery kind of evolved into mass incarceration after it was abolished. I listened to 3 episodes of the podcast Code Switch, which is a podcast produced by NPR, and it's hosted by 2 journalists of color. They kind of go into how race intersects in different areas of society and their experiences with race. So I found that really interesting. And they talked a lot about the Black Lives Matter movement and how race has affected coronavirus and how it affects different races differently. And I found that to relate well to one of the sources that we had in our annotated bibliography. It was called Implicit Bias in Policing, and it was by Spencer et al. And I thought talking about how law enforcement can have implicit bias tied in well with that source. And then my last immersion activity was watching the show Dear White People on Netflix, and that focuses on the discrimination that students of color face on college campuses, which I thought tied in with the source, an exploration of possible unconscious ethnic biases in higher education, which was also in our annotated bibliography. And it also kind of tied in with the interview that I did with my community partner, because my community partner was a student in Purdue's Honors College. She's a student diversity officer. And so she kind of gave me some insight into the discrimination that students of color face on Purdue's campus, which I thought was really interesting. So I think all of those activities will inform our research paper well, and they gave me a lot of insight into my own implicit biases. One assumption that I had before starting this project was I was kind of unclear about the term Black and whether it was offensive to refer to someone as Black, but I learned through the podcast Code Switch and other articles that it's actually sometimes more accurate than referring to someone as African American, because they're brought here involuntarily a lot of the time, and they don't know where their families are from and that piece of their ancestry. So they might be from a Caribbean island or something, not necessarily Africa, and it's kind of assuming to refer to them as African American. So using the term Black refers more to the culture and community that they have created in the United States. And that was something really interesting that I'm glad I was able to have cleared up.
Okay, so for some of my immersion activities, I also watched the documentary 13th, which, like she said, kind of speaks on systematic racism in the world and some of the continued failings of the judicial system in the United States. I also watched a handful of YouTube videos from multiple different authors and things like that, mostly covering implicit and unconscious bias and some of the current racisms we see in the world, having a lot to do with the Black Lives Matter movement, things like that. The movie I watched was called The Express, the Ernie Davis story. It's a depiction of the life of Ernie Davis, he was the first African-American to win the Heisman Trophy. It speaks of the prejudice he faced even within his own team, from his coach and his teammates, especially other teams as he got farther down the line, and some of the actions and the steps he took to fight these prejudices and to kind of pave the way for other African American athletes behind him. I learned a lot more about implicit biases that people have, and even some that I had and I didn't know I had, and how I can help change them. I also learned more about the challenges that African Americans are facing every day within biases and racisms. So kind of an assumption I had coming from a very, very small town with very little to no African American presence. I assumed their life was kind of just like mine. I really had no idea. But during some of the research I was doing for this project, found out it's really not the case. I discovered a lot of the biases held against them and how we need to acknowledge them and help change them and fix them.
So for me, my research topic is mainly focused on the Asian American and some specific cases that happened recently when the coronavirus pandemic has happened, an outbreak. And actually, I found that it's a very interesting phenomenon that the bias and even in the implicit bias is constantly changed. It's something like the conditional related topic. I have interviewed a professor who is research on this topic, and she told me that the bias is something like the cultural and the conditional related. So it will change and it will develop a new form and can be changed in another ways. And actually, she told me that some words were originally was used to eliminate the bias, but finally, when some people are abuse this terminology, it can be aggressive forms in the future. So this idea was really inspiring for me, actually, because my previous assumption is that the bias are something that is have long history or is basically the stable or can be passed from generation to generation, but the bias idea can be constantly changed, and especially for this specific. And I also watched some video series and documentary about the Asian Americans that face today in the American, and especially some videos in the YouTube that about the recent pandemic. It's very specific form that has changed, like the wear the facial mask, about some language abuse about this part, this newly form of implicit bias. So it's sometimes confirmed that the idea of that the bias is changed and can be developed in another way, and we should be aware of this feature of it.
So for my immersion projects, I decided to focus on South Asians in America because the person I interviewed, she is a student at Purdue who is a South Asian American. And so I realized that I don't actually know much about their life in America, so I decided to look more into it. And the documentary I watched is called Raising Our Voices, which is a documentary which investigated the effects of the September 11 attacks on South Asians living in America. It was interesting because even though it happened so long ago, I feel like the aftermath can be seen today still in the discrimination against that group of people. One thing I learned that was interesting while watching that documentary was that hate crimes against South Asian Americans has actually been happening since before 9/11. The documentary said that these crimes actually hit spotlights in the 1980s, which shows that in the US there was already a bias against them, and that the September 11 events only made the biases against them stronger. I also watched a few YouTube videos. I watched one which was an interview with the winner of the Miss America in 2014, who is a South Asian American, and she talked about how there was a lack of representation in the media of South Asians, and she explained how that made it difficult for people to understand their culture, because without representation, it's difficult for others to form cultural competency. And I also watched two other videos about implicit biases South Asians felt within their own race. And from other races as well. One thing I also found interesting was that it seems that people tend to group South Asians together in one big group, even though they all come from many different countries and religions and backgrounds. And I thought that really related to the guest speaker who came and talked about race. She was wearing a different outfit, and people assumed that because of her clothes, she wasn't from the US, which seems to happen a lot with South Asian Americans too.
So the group I focused on in my immersion activities was kind of about Black Americans and the implicit biases and racism kind of surrounding that group of people in the United States. And I chose to focus on this area because it seems like a really relevant issue in today's society, and a problem like I haven't really known that much about in my life, and I think is really important, like, to be more aware of that. So the documentary I focused on and watched was called Teach Us All, and it kind of followed like after the Brown versus Board of Education case, kind of how segregation still persists in the American school system, specifically in Little Rock, New York City, and Los Angeles. And I thought this was like really interesting and pertinent because like a lot of times like with these Supreme Court cases where like, oh, like kind of racism doesn't exist in schools anymore, it's kind of like gave me a firsthand like show of how that's not necessarily true. And I think it's really relevant to all of us, like as students in college, to kind of see like the way it can affect some of our peers and people like that. And then one other video I'll just highlight on is what's called My Road Trip Through the Whitest Towns in America by Rich Benjamin, and it was actually a TED Talk. And it discussed his visits to some of the whitest towns in America and kind of what we can all learn to gain from his experiences. And that was really interesting because he was able to like meet with some people like from small towns, like you were talking about, Sam, and kind of like get to know them and talk to them. And that's kind of just really interesting to see like that firsthand experience, because I know for our research question, like we talked a lot about like scientific articles and all of that, and it was interesting to see that like firsthand. So that's just something of what I did.
Yeah.
Hi, I chose to immerse myself in the Hispanic American culture. I chose this group because it's very prevalent in my area, and I interviewed Rochelle Ranking from the Center of Culture in Fort Wayne. The three media options I chose to watch, the movie I chose was La Misma Luna, which is about a mother and a son who came across the border and then got split up, and just kind of their experience throughout the whole situation and getting detained and stuff on the border. And then I also watched three various TED Talks by different Hispanic Americans and just their experiences within different like colleges, schools, work atmosphere, and what they've been through and the implicit bias they have felt. And then the documentary I chose to watch was called Ruben Salazar, A Man in the Middle, and it was a documentary about an American journalist, or a Mexican-American journalist who had difficulties in his career due to his race. And then throughout this process and the different things I've watched, I learned that 63% of Latinos do not feel welcome in America, according to the Harvard Business Review, which is very disheartening, and I didn't realize that. But then watching those different documentaries and videos kind of showed me more that I did not realize was happening in the country. And another interesting fact I learned is that only 61% of the Latinos in America are from Mexico, which I assumed would have been a little higher. And then the others just come from different Hispanic countries. So that was interesting.
So now I'm going to talk about the information synthesis portion of our project. And to answer the question, how does your experience compare to what you learned from the research articles your group has read? Like kind of when going back and looking through our quantitative bibliography that we made earlier in the semester, like I noticed one of the main things was that many of the papers, like mostly peer-reviewed journal articles that we had discussed, such as discrimination and implicit bias in a racially unequal society in the California Law Review journal. Many of these were very factual, had a lot of statistics, and kind of like what I've learned from hearing about all of your immersion activities, where that kind of we are able to immerse ourselves within these first-person perspectives and stories and really learn firsthand the racism and biases a lot of these marginalized groups are facing. So it's definitely interesting to see from that perspective. And kind of going along with that, for writing our research paper, I think it was really helpful to learn about the different groups we each focus on, whether it be South Asian Americans or Mexican Americans. Definitely having those perspectives will really help us write the research paper. We kind of just more stories than just statistics, because this is a really important issue to address. And I feel a lot of times because people, if they don't have the first-hand experience with it, it is really helpful to hear these stories and everything, kind of just rather than statistics about that. So it was really interesting to hear kind of everything that you guys had immersed yourself in.